Welcome to my ATL training session. I'd like you to imagine that this is a training session happening in real time, that you have time for collaboration, time for interactivity and discussion. Obviously, this is just a video version for those that can't attend an in-person training, or if a teacher near the school wants to do this training, this will help guide them too. You'll also find that when I talk about approaches to learning, I often call them ATLs. Now, there's no such thing as approaches to learnings, but ATLs is much easier than saying A's TL. So that's why I say that. So you can pause the video at any time to read what's on screen, and obviously some of the questions there, we'd always have time for a discussion if this was happening in real time. So, what is the point of school? Why do our students come to school for many, many years? What do we want them to know or do or have when they graduate? What is our purpose? So, some people may say qualifications or getting into a good university or a good job or preparation for life. Really, the IB's focus and our school's focus is on developing lifelong learners. If students have those skills to be a lifelong learner, they should be able to get good qualifications, get into a good university, get a good job, and be prepared for life. If you think about the careers that will exist in the future, they don't exist now. Think about the world that we live in the future. We don't know what that's going to look like. So having those skills, learning to learn, is going to be beneficial for them as they grow older. And what does a lifelong learner look like? So we hear this phrase a lot. However, if we all wrote it down on paper, we could all be correct, but I'm sure our descriptions all look very, very different. It's such a broad topic that we might say self-motivated, self-regulated. You might say someone that seeks out documentaries or goes to museums. They can all look very, very different. So maybe instead of thinking what a lifelong learner looks like, we should think about the skills that those students need to have to classify themselves as a lifelong learner. So things like communication, research, etc. So we also need to think about, as teachers, how do we know that students have these skills, and how do the students know they have these skills? So that's really where the ATLs come into. So the IB breaks the ATLs into 5 clear sections: communication, social, self-management, research, and thinking skills. Now those still sound kind of broad. For example, when I get students to reflect on all 5 in the personal project, which they do in the report, if I just say, write about your thinking skills, that sounds so vague that students don't really know what to put. They put, of course I did thinking, but they don't know how that looks or how to describe that. So the IB breaks them down into 10 clusters. So thinking skills could be critical thinking, creative thinking, or transfer of skills. And that really helps students a little bit more, but the IB goes further and breaks them down even more. So what I'm going to do is just exit out this presentation and show you a spreadsheet which breaks down those skills into clear descriptors. So for example, if I go into thinking here, I can look and I can say, oh, okay, it's evaluate and manage risk, or apply skills, knowledge in unfamiliar situations, or generate metaphors and analogies. You can go into research, you can see more information and media literacy skills. Self-management, which again is not just organisation and time management, but also effective and reflective skills. Social, which really means collaboration, and communication skills. I also have the ATL descriptors here to guide my students further. So having those ATLs is really clear, but what do we do with them? So we have to make sure that they're taught and that they are given a chance to improve them throughout the development of the 5 years of the MYP. Often some of these things we think, oh, someone else is doing that. You know, research, oh, the librarians are doing that, oh, the English teachers are doing that, or things about health, oh, that's covered in PE. We're going to map it as IB teachers so that we can see exactly what skills are taught and where. They're also all of our responsibilities, not just those different departments or teams. They are not formally assessed in the MYP as such, but you might want to reflect on them in the report. You might want to link them to an assessment in a unit. And in the MYP's personal project, they do reflect on all 5 ATLs in their report. They also provide a common language for students and teachers. So, for example, getting students to look at the ATLs, which ones they have demonstrated in a unit, or which ones they need to work on, using them as language to help you with your report, to help students be focused or set goals. It's a really useful document. For example, I had a student who just was stressing out a lot about personal project, and we looked at the self-management ATLs, and there's one about practicing ways of reducing stress. So she's going to brainstorm around the ATL and think about the skills that she needs to do that. And there needs to be clear expectations, benchmarks, and there needs to be different opportunities to practice. So it can't just be this invisible thing that happens somehow. We need to put tasks into lessons. We need to put it into things like assembly and grade levels. We need to make sure that they see examples. We don't just say, you're going to research and I want you to use primary and secondary sources. We would show them some of those, or give them a checklist that has different source types or different activities that steer them towards that. So we really need to lay it out in order for them to be successful in developing those skills. So how do you learn a new skill? So we want to make sure that the ways that students are learning these new skills is not the same. They're not just writing down each skill and how they're going to do it. They need to have multiple opportunities and different methods to do it. We'll also find that if we don't teach these skills, our students are not going to be able to be as successful as they would with all those skills when they graduate. So how many students do you know who miss deadlines, don't complete work, fail to cite correctly, don't take notes in class, turn up to class about the wrong equipment, basically all these disorganized things here? Many. I know that often when we talk about students who are struggling, it's because of these reasons. Often when the students are not getting good grades, it's because they're negative approaches to learning or because they don't have those skills. So imagine that you had a student who is able to do all of these things easily and confidently. For example, bring all the correct equipment to class, setting goals that are challenging, using different learning techniques. Well, this is just the skills that are there for self-management, organizational skills. If you look again at all these ATLs, imagine if you had a student graduating the MYP who was able to communicate in all these ways, was able to collaborate in all these ways, manage themselves in all these ways, research using these skills, and was able to think using these skills. They would be fantastic. We would be able to focus on our classwork, our assessments, the things that we want them to learn. We wouldn't have to be worrying about deadlines, giving them extra time, giving them extra work after school, because they would be these fantastic super learners. Obviously, no one graduates with all those skills perfected. In fact, if you look at yourself as a teacher, I know myself, there are definitely skills that I need to still work on improving. But if, as a team, we're all working on pushing those ATLs into our curriculum, both in subjects and through assemblies, advisory, etc., then we're really going to have some awesome students graduating our school. So what tools and techniques are we currently using to help students develop these skills? Now, it might sound like a big daunting task, a lot more paperwork, oh my goodness, I now have to also do ATLs. There are probably things that teachers are already doing to support students in developing their approaches to learning, but you might not have made that connection. I have an ATL toolkit link down here, which has every single strand along with some methods to teach those. But it could be that you're using Think, Pair, Share as a way for students to collaborate effectively, or you're using See, Think, Wonder, a thinking routine that supports one of the thinking skills. Maybe Peel is a technique you're using to get them to focus on paragraphing correctly. Maybe hot seating you're using as a tool for them to develop their empathy skills. So it really is about thinking about those activities that you already have in class and then looking at those self-management skills and seeing which ones they link to. Because I think we're already doing a fantastic job of using them, we're just not formalising it properly quite yet. So planning for ATLs, when we look at the IB standards and practices, we need to see that we need to have it built into our written curriculum, and we need to also track our ATLs. We can't have every single student just learning about giving and receiving meaningful feedback in every single unit for all 5 years of the MYP and not developing those other skills. We also need to figure out that if you're doing an ATL focus in your unit, which I recommend doing 2 or 3 per unit, that you're formalising that, and that every ATL which is documented in your written curriculum in your units links to the unit's objectives. So it's not just a standalone task, it's not just something that you do all the time, it's a formalized learning experience. It also has to be something that is a new skill, a new way of doing a skill that you're giving them. So, for example, giving and receiving meaningful feedback, probably every unit will have some sort of class presentation or class discussion, and so in theory, they're doing that, they're practicing that skill. But you need to think about the times you're giving them a new technique for doing that. For example, you might give them the tag technique. T for tell them something you like, A for ask a question, and G for give advice. So think about those new chances that you're actually purposely working on ATLs in class. So here is an example of how the ATL supports the objective. So this is maths. For their criterion C, which is communicating, the objective is organise information using logical structure. So they've gone for the communication ATL, organise and depict information logically. So you can see those fit really nicely. And then the link to assessment is in order for a student to organise information using a logical structure, students must organise and depict information logically. So maybe they're doing a number flow chart, they're doing some sort of infographic to support this. In English, this is a mystery unit, and they have, in order for students to analyse the effect of a creator's choice on the audience, students must gather and organise relevant information to formulate an argument. So that's a thinking, critical thinking, ATL, and criterion A, analysing. So this could be a sketchnoting activity where they're listening out loud to the class read the text, and as they're doing that, they're sketchnoting all their ideas, and they're putting that to an essay or presentation at the end. So ATLs, it's a mandatory section of the unit. So it's in the from principles into practice, along with things like the unit title, key concept, related concept, global context, statement of inquiry, the subject objectives, and the content. It is a requirement. Now again, this is where you just write down those that you purposefully are teaching. So don't just go in and tick every single ATL which they practice or every ATL which relates to the unit. Just pick about 2 or 3 which you're really giving them the time to develop those skills in class. Throughout the curriculum in each subject, you obviously need to have all the required key concepts covered, all the related concepts covered, the global context covered, and this is across the 5 years. So for example, you can't just have one global context for every single unit or 2, you must cover all 5. You have to give them different ways to achieve the objective. So don't just give them essays, don't just give them performances, give them different assessment types. And you must appropriately develop all ATL skill categories. Now that's categories. So for example, you don't need to do every single strand because there's some which don't always fit directly into written curriculum. For example, practicing strategies to eliminate bullying, or practicing mindfulness. Those might be outside of the subject curriculum, but you need to do all 5. So you need to make sure you're doing activities that relate to communication, thinking, social skills, etc. So that's the implicit way that we're teaching the ATLs. So embedding them into our subjects and giving them the learning engagements which link to our subject objectives. There's also an explicit type. So this is like ATL focused activities that you might do in advisory, an assembly, through our school counsellors. And they can often be things like strategies for time management. So for example, in the personal project, we have a lot of activities in our advisory sessions in grade 10 that help them focus on their self-management, particularly their time management. For example, creating Gantt charts or looking at bullet journals. It could also be more things to do with kind of student well-being, like affective skills. So this again is where the counsellors, advisors, heads of year, assembly leaders, learning support and the personal coordinator come in. And it might be that often these skills that are explicitly taught are done not just in a grade 6 English class F block taught by Miss McKilson, but they're often done grade-wide, or they're often done as a standalone activity, for example, something you do off timetable for the afternoon with the counsellors. So for most ATLs, there's an explicit and an implicit way to teach them. So an example here is the skill communication, paraphrase accurately and concisely. So in advisory, it could be that every student reads a different news article, paraphrases it and shares it out with the class. Or it could be the implicit, so for a subject, maybe like English, students are reading To Kill a Mockingbird, they paraphrase, writing key quotes and summarising key ideas in their journal, which they end up using to write their summative project, which is a speech about the importance of teaching this book in the US. So I recommend a good activity is to look through the different subheadings and pick out a skill and think about explicit and implicit ways we're teaching them. Obviously, there are some which are going to be really, really focused for in the classroom and some which will be focused for outside, but there are opportunities for many to be done both ways. At a school, it's important that you map your skills to make sure that every single skill is being taught either through the written curriculum or outside, and that students have a chance to develop them. So in this map, which I've linked here, there is space to put in all the information needed. So for example, I could be doing giving and receiving meaningful feedback in grade 1, so I'd press a little X here. In my English class, the title of the unit, what we're doing, what activity we're doing, and how it links. If I was a counsellor, I can just ignore some of these If I was a counsellor, I can ignore some of these headings, and below I would put an X here. I would say making good decisions by the counsellors, the activity, and I would ignore subject objective criterion and unit titles. It's important to map all of these out, and this template should help you. So a reminder that ATLs are really going to help our students to be lifelong learners, and that it's a responsibility of everyone to help them strengthen those.